Hello, everybody. My name is Catalina Garcia, and this is my presentation on the peripheral nervous system, specifically the autonomic portion of the peripheral nervous system. So for just a quick overview of what we will be covering today, we're going to go over a general structure breakdown of the peripheral nervous system with a general overview, looking specifically at the autonomic portion, which can be broken down further. And then we can see the peripheral nervous system in research. So for the peripheral nervous system, the nervous system, as we can see, is broken into two parts. We have the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system. This has afferent and efferent divisions. And this picture here is just a general overview of what we'll be further going into. This side here being the central nervous system, the effector organ, and the pathway, the bridge, what is connecting these two being the autonomic portion. So we will continue going into this. The peripheral nervous system is composed of the afferent and efferent fibers, as I stated earlier. It relays signals between the central nervous system and the periphery, which are the other parts of the body. So as this picture is showing here, the autonomic nervous system, I'm assuming you can see my mouse. So here on this picture in the middle, the peripheral nervous system relays signals between the central nervous system to other parts of the body, in this case, an organ. Once informed by the afferent division of the peripheral nervous system of any change in the internal or external environment, the central nervous system makes the appropriate adjustments for our bodies to maintain homeostasis. So the peripheral nervous system alerts the central nervous system of any internal or external environmental changes that the central nervous system may have to maintain. This is through the afferent and efferent fibers. So going to the central nervous system, and then from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system to the periphery. The central nervous system makes appropriate adjustments that will maintain body homeostasis. This occurs by transmission signals from the central nervous system to these organs through the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system, this picture being an example. Skeletal muscle is innervated by the somatic nervous system, the branch of the efferent division subject to voluntary control. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for involuntary responses. So this is a quick picture, a very general, an overview of the breakdown. So as we stated earlier, the nervous system, we have the peripheral, and then the central being brain and spinal cord. And this peripheral nervous system, we have a further division of the autonomic nervous system, which we will be talking about today, and then the somatic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system, as I had just stated, is responsible for involuntary responses. And here we see the further breakdown into the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. The sympathetic nervous system activates the fight or flight response during a perceived threat or danger that our body warns us for, and then the parasympathetic nervous system restores the body to a state of calm. So, other words, the sympathetic division, in shorter words, controls our fight or flight, while the parasympathetic division is our rest or digest, which are catchy phrases that helps summarize and remember what these two divisions are in control of. So going further, this is a very, it looks confusing, but it's simply saying and showing how the sympathetic and parasympathetic innervate organs and areas, muscles of our body these innervations are necessary to to impart the instructions that the central nervous system is giving to the peripheral nervous system. Because as we said earlier here, the central nervous system is connected to the periphery, which are organs or muscles, through the peripheral nervous system. So these are the affected portions of our body. Going further into this picture, the effect of sympathetic stimulation on certain organs also has a parasympathetic effect. So these organs are innervated by the sympathetic as well as the parasympathetic. To break down this picture even further, we can look at some examples. So for the heart here, we can see it's innervated by both the sympathetic and parasympathetic. From the sympathetic, the effect is an increased heart rate and an increased force of contraction to the whole heart, whereas the effect from the parasympathetic, so from this side, is a decreased heart rate and decreased force of contraction of the atria only. So these are contradictory actions that are being enacted on the heart. And this is important to understand because most of these actions from the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic are going to be contradictory or antagonistic approaches to the body. This is because, as we stated here, the parasympathetic and sympathetic are divided for a purpose, the parasympathetic being our rest and digest and the sympathetic being our fight or flight. So of course, they're going to enact different functions onto the organs here. So going on with more examples, for the lungs, we can see the innervations. For the lungs, the effect of the sympathetic stimulation has a dilation of the bronchioles, which are our airways, and then it inhibits mucus secretion. Sorry, let me say that again. Dilates the bronchioles and inhibits mucus secretion. These are the effects of the sympathetic stimulation. Whereas the effect of the parasympathetic stimulation on the lungs constricts the bronchioles versus dilating, and stimulates the mucus secretion instead of inhibiting. Another contradictory effect. Next, in our digestive tract, we can see there's a decrease in motility, and the contract sphincters, which then prevent forward movement of contents. It inhibits digestive secretions. Inhibiting digestion is the effect on the sympathetic, from the sympathetic, whereas the effect of the parasympathetic sees an increase in motility and relaxes sphincters. It stimulates digestion. So in the sympathetic, we have a restriction of digestion, whereas in the parasympathetic, there is a stimulation. Excuse me. Continuing on, I won't go over every single part here, but another big one we have is our urinary bladder, whereas in the sympathetic, our fight or flight, we have a relaxation, whereas in our parasympathetic, there is a constriction. And then we'll go over one more. In our eyes, there is a dilation of the pupil as well as an adjustment for far vision from the sympathetic, and then a constriction of the pupil and adjustment for near vision from our parasympathetic. As you can imagine, each of these effects that are enacted on each of these organs make sense. So for the sympathetic, in your fight or flight, you're going to want to be able to see farther. So your eyes are going to get ready for far vision. You're going to want to have increased airways because you're either going to fight or you're going to flight, which you need increased airways. So you need your blood flowing. You need your bronchioles to be dilated so that you can get an increase of air, airflow. And then in your parasympathetic, when you're resting, when you're able to stop and breathe, you're going to be able to constrict your bladder. You're going to be able to resume digestion, which is a huge source of our energy being spent. So we should be glad that in our sympathetic response, digestion does cease so that blood and energy can go to our limbs, can go to our brains, can go to our eyes to help us fight or flight, to help us in that mode. Whereas in our parasympathetic, this rest and digest, we're able to uptake those processes which take up a lot of energy but are necessary. So our stomach can continue digestion. Our lungs don't have to be dilated so much because we're breathing regularly. Our eyes can look up close, so our we don't need to have prepare for only far vision, for example. So just in general, from this picture, what I want to convey is that major organs, muscles are innervated by the sympathetic and parasympathetic, that the sympathetic has usually contradictory effects on these organs versus the parasympathetic. So the sympathetic, fight or flight, whereas the parasympathetic is our rest and digest. So those were the two. These are the main divisions of the, if I can go back here. So our parasympathetic here, our sympathetic here being the major divisions of our autonomic nervous system. So in research, our autonomic nervous system, this research is, the present study is examining the contribution of the sympathetic nervous system to blood pressure dipping. This is seen through a sample of 172 men and women, which are aged between 25 and 45 years. Specifically in the study, we are looking at the contribution of the sympathetic nervous system, this system, sympathetic nervous system here, or sympathetic nervous system, remember our fight or flight, as it contributes to blood pressure dipping. Further, there is a marked diurnal variation in blood pressure, with blood pressure dipping to its lowest levels during nighttime sleep. So we're looking at the sympathetic contribution to this dipping during nighttime sleep. A day-to-night dip in systolic blood pressure of 10% is what we will label and characterize as non-dippers. These non-dippers are associated with an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. So we're seeing how sympathetic nervous system plays into this. Research found through assessments of 24-hour ambulatory blood pressure monitoring of both waking and sleeping urinary catecholamines. In addition, cardiovascular alpha and beta adrenergic receptor, or AR, responsiveness was determined. So we can see this, what I'm saying verbally is what we're seeing visually on these graphs. Okay, so cardiovascular alpha and beta adrenergic receptor responsiveness was determined via doses of isopropanol and phenylephrine. Non-dippers also were characterized by heightened alpha AR responses compared with dippers. So the data that we found, the data that we're looking at visually here, suggests that the SNS, which is our sympathetic nervous system, does contribute to individual differences in nighttime blood pressure dipping. And it appears to account in part for blunted blood pressure dipping, specifically in African Americans, as this study did look at different races and compared their data to it. So looking at these graphs now, of the 172 participants, 116 showed a fall in SBP, which is our systolic blood pressure, of less than 10% during nighttime sleep, and were thus categorized as dippers. Whereas the remaining 56 showed a fall of less than 10%. So the previous one was greater than 10%. The remaining 56 showed a fall of less than 10% and were categorized as non-dippers. The diurnal blood pressure variation for dippers compared to non-dippers is what we see here. Diurnal variation in systolic blood pressure in dippers are our boxes here connected by lines, and then our non-dippers are the circles. So going back, the data suggests that the SNS, which again stands for our sympathetic nervous system, does contribute to individual differences in nighttime blood pressure dipping. And it does account for the blunted blood pressure dipping of African Americans, which we know, because it was stated earlier, that this does impose an increased risk for cardiovascular disease. So that is how the sympathetic nervous system is contributing to blood pressure dipping in this present study. So just to recap what we reviewed, we went over the peripheral nervous system. We see how the central nervous system connects to the peripheral nervous system, specifically the autonomic portion, as it is then imposed on effector organs and stuff, which we could see here. how they are connected. Again, the nervous system is broken up into peripheral and central, peripheral being further broken up into our afferent and efferent, which is our autonomic and somatic. And then our autonomic being further divided, finally divided into the parasympathetic and sympathetic. Again, a quick recap, the sympathetic being our fight or flight, our parasympathetic being our rest and digest, continuously having contradictory effects on these primary organs and muscles. Here are my references. And that was my presentation on the peripheral nervous system, specifically the autonomic portion. Thank you so very much.